During World War II, an American Air Force unit was stationed in the English countryside, and the airmen often visited the local pub. One day, an experienced Air Force man was showing a new arrival around. As they approached the pub, the seasoned airman said, "These English yokels are so dumb. Wait till you see this." They walked up to two locals who were sitting at a table enjoying a drink. The airman placed a nickel and a dime in front of them and asked, "Which of these do you think is worth more?" One of the locals looked at the coins, scratched his head, and said, well, I reckon the bigger, shinier coin must be worth more." The airman chuckled at this and walked into the pub, leaving the nickel and dime on the table. The second local turned to the first and said, "Oi, Henry, you know as well as I do that the dime is worth twice the nickel." "Aye," Henry replied with a grin, "but if I told him that, they'd stop playing the game." Then he pointed to a bucket under the table. "So far, I've made $30 this month playing this little game with the American Airmen." You know you're in Darwin when the best parking spot is chosen based on shade rather than distance. Hot water comes out of both taps. You learn that a seatbelt buckle can double as a branding iron. The temperature drops below 32 degrees Celsius, and you start feeling a bit chilly. You discover that in February, it only takes 2 fingers to steer your car. You realize you can get sunburnt through your car window. You develop a deep fear of metal car door handles. You break a sweat the instant you step outside at 7:30 a.m. Your biggest fear on a bicycle is getting knocked out and cooking to death on the pavement. You realize asphalt can melt in the heat. Farmers are feeding their chickens crushed ice to stop them from laying hard-boiled eggs. The trees start whistling for the dogs. While walking barefoot back to your car from the beach, you do a tightrope act on the white lines in the parking lot. You catch a cold from having the air conditioning cranked up while you sleep at night. You realize that Casuarina Square isn't just a shopping center, it's a temple dedicated to air conditioning. A man's fear of needles led to a rather unconventional solution at the dentist's office. As the dentist began preparing the nitrous oxide, the patient quickly objected, citing his inability to handle the gas. The very thought of wearing a mask made him feel suffocated. The dentist, understanding the patient's concerns, offered an alternative. "Would you be okay taking a pill instead?" he asked. The patient, relieved, agreed, thinking a pill would be a more manageable option. However, what happened next was completely unexpected. The dentist returned with a pill, but it wasn't a painkiller. With a mischievous grin, he handed the patient a Viagra tablet. The patient was stunned and exclaimed, "Viagra? I didn't know that was a painkiller." With a chuckle, the dentist replied, "It's not, but it'll give you something to hold on to when I pull your tooth." Two college students accidentally miss their math final exam. The next day, they go to plead with their professor. Feeling in a good mood, he agrees to let them retake the exam, but with a twist. He tells them to come back the next day for an oral exam. When they both show up, he tells one to wait outside while he tests the other. One student enters, and the other presses his ear to the door to listen. The professor begins with a question. "You're riding in a train car, and it gets too hot. What do you do?" The student replies, "I open the window." The professor continues, "Okay. Now that window is 2 feet wide and 3 feet high. The train is traveling at 50 miles per hour to the north, and the wind is blowing at 15 miles per hour to the east. How long will it take for the new air to replace the old air in the car?" The student, clearly confused, stammers, "I don't know." The professor gives him an F, dismisses him, and calls in the other student. He begins asking his friend, "You are riding in a train car and it gets too hot. What do you do?" The student responds, "I take my jacket off." The professor says, "Okay, but it's still too hot." The student replies, "I take my shirt off." The professor nods and asks, "I understand, but it's really hot now." The student says, "Well, I'll just get naked." The professor, still testing, asks, "Okay, but there are other people in the car who will see you get naked." The student pauses and says, "With all due respect, Professor, I don't care if my grandmother and my priest are there. There's no way I'm opening that darn window." The teacher asked the class to use the word fascinate in a sentence. Molly raised her hand and said, My family went to my granddad's farm and we all saw his pet sheep. It was fascinating. The teacher replied, "That was good, but I wanted you to use the word fascinate, not fascinating." Carolyn raised her hand and said, "My family went to see New York City, and I was fascinated." The teacher sighed. "Well, that was good, Caroline, but I wanted you to use the word fascinate." Little Johnny raised his hand. The teacher, knowing Johnny's reputation as a scamp, was now desperate to finish the lesson. She sighed, thinking there was no way he could mess up the word fascinate. "Go ahead, Johnny," she said. Johnny grinned and said, "My Aunt Carolyn has a sweater with 10 buttons, but her breasts are so big she can only fasten 8. The teacher sat down and cried. It was the first day of school, and a new student named Pedro, the son of a Mexican telecom tycoon, entered the 4th grade. The teacher began, "Let's review some American history. Who said, 'Give me liberty' or 'Give me death'?" She saw a sea of blank faces except for Pedro, who had his hand up. "Patrick Henry, 1775. Pedro said, "Very good. Now who said, 'Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth'?" Again, no response except from Pedro. "Abraham Lincoln, 1863. The teacher was impressed. "Class, you should be ashamed. Pedro, who is new to our country, knows more about its history than you do." Then a loud whisper echoed through the room. "Screw the Mexicans." The teacher demanded, "Who said that?" Pedro raised his hand. "Jim Bowie, 1836, he replied. At that point, another student said, "I'm going to puke." The teacher glared. "All right, who said that?" Once again, Pedro raised his hand. "George Bush to the Japanese Prime Minister, 1991. Now furious, another student yelled, "Oh yeah, suck this!" Pedro jumped out of his chair, waving his hand and shouting, "Bill Clinton to Monica Lewinsky, 1997. The class was in chaos. Someone shouted, "You little shit, if you say anything else, I'll kill you." Pedro frantically yelled, "Gary Condit to Chandra Levy, 2001. The teacher fainted. As the class gathered around her on the floor, someone said, "Oh crap, we're in big trouble now." Pedro whispered, "Saddam Hussein, 2003. A physics professor had a student who was always late and always had an answer, whether right or wrong. One day, the professor decided to put him on the spot in front of the class. "Tell me, Michael, what's faster, light or sound?" "Light, obviously," Michael replied without hesitation. "All right, why?" the professor asked. "Well," Michael said, "when I turn on my TV, I first see the picture and then hear the sound." The professor sighed deeply, giving him, "I can't believe this look." He decided to move on. He asked the next student, "What's faster, light or sound?" "Well, obviously it's sound," came the answer. The professor, a bit taken aback, said, What? Why do you think that?" "Well," the student replied, "when I turn on my TV, I first hear it and then see the picture." The professor was getting increasingly annoyed. He thought perhaps the question was too difficult for these students, so he decided to try a different approach. He asked the next student, "You're standing at the foot of a mountain. There's a cannon on the summit. When the cannon is fired, do you first see the flash of light or hear the sound?" "Obviously, you first see the light," the student answered confidently. The professor, slightly hopeful, asked, "And why is that?" "Well," the student said, "because your eyes are obviously further ahead than your ears." I went on a blind date with a woman I met online. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much, probably a 300 pounder with bad skin. But when I showed up at her door, I was floored. There she was, a 5'2", baby blue eyes, strawberry blonde hair, absolutely stunning. I couldn't believe my luck. We started chatting, and I asked her what she did for a living. "I teach Sunday school," she said. Now, I've never dated a Christian girl, but I'm open-minded, so I decided to take her to dinner. On the way, I lit a joint and asked her if she smoked. "Oh, heavens no," she replied. "Why would I tell my Sunday school children?" I thought, okay, not everyone's into that. No big deal. We got to the restaurant, and I ordered the steak. She went for the lobster. I ordered the second most expensive bottle of wine. When the waitress came over to pour, she said, "I don't drink." "You don't drink?" I asked. Oh, heavens, no. What would I tell my Sunday school children? The food was amazing, and the conversation was sparkling, but I was feeling a little out of my element. On the way back, we passed a cheap motel. I figured, why not, I asked. Want to get a room and, you know? Without missing a beat, she replied, I thought you'd never ask. I was surprised, but before I could get too excited, I said, wait, what are you going to tell your Sunday school children? She smiled and said, the same thing I tell them every week. You don't have to drink or do drugs to have a good time. Miss Williams, a first-grade teacher, was having trouble with one of her students, Jerry. One day she asked him, Jerry, what's your problem? Jerry replied, I'm too smart for first grade. My sister is in third grade and I'm smarter than she is. I think I should be in fifth grade. Miss Williams had had enough. She took Jerry to the principal's office where she explained the situation. The principal, intrigued, said he'd give Jerry a test. If he couldn't answer any questions, he'd have to stay in first grade and behave. Jerry agreed, and the test began. Principal, what's 3 times 3? Jerry, 9. Principal, what's 6 times 6? Jerry, 36. The principal continued with a series of questions he thought a third grader should know. With each answer, Jerry kept impressing him. The principal turned to Miss Williams and said, I think Jerry can move to third grade. But Miss Williams wasn't done. She asked the principal, can I ask him a few questions? The principal and Jerry agreed. Miss Williams, what does a cow have 4 of that I have only 2 of? Jerry, thinking for a moment, legs? Miss Williams, what's in your pants that you have but I don't? Jerry, quick to reply, pockets. Miss Williams, what does a dog do that a man steps into? Jerry, pants. Miss Williams, what starts with a C, ends with a T, is hairy, oval, delicious, and contains thin, whitish liquid? Jerry, coconut. The principal, now nervous, was trying to make sense of these questions. But Miss Williams wasn't done. Miss Williams, what goes in hard and pink, then comes out soft and sticky? Jerry, without hesitation, bubble gum. Miss Williams, what does a man do standing up? A woman does sitting down, and a dog does on 3 legs? Jerry, shake hands. The principal was trembling, but Miss Williams had one final question. Miss Williams, what word starts with F and ends in K and means a lot of heat and excitement? Jerry, fire truck. The principal let out a huge sigh of relief and turned to Miss Williams, saying, put Jerry in 5th grade. I got the last 7 questions wrong. A missionary who had spent years teaching a tribe how to farm and build things to be self-sufficient gets word that it's time for him to return home. He realizes, however, that the one thing he never taught them was how to speak English. So he decides to take the chief on a walk through the forest to teach him. He points to a tree and says, "This is a tree." The chief looks at the tree and repeats, "Tree." Pleased with the response, the missionary continues. They walk a little farther and he points to a rock. "This is a rock," he says. The chief looks and responds, "Rock." Feeling confident, the missionary gets even more excited, but then he hears a rustling in the bushes. Curious, he peeks over and sees a couple in the midst of heavy sexual activity. Flustered, he quickly points and says, "Riding a bike." Without missing a beat, the chief pulls out his blowgun and kills them. The missionary is horrified and yells, "How could you do that? After all the years I've spent teaching you how to be civilized, you just killed them in cold blood." The chief looks at him and says, "My bike." A young boy says to his father, "Dad, my math teacher wants to see you." The father, concerned, asks, "What happened?" "Well, she asked me, what's 7 times 9? I said, it's 63. Then she asked, "And what's 9 times 7? So I asked, "What's the bloody difference?" "Fair point," says the father. "What is the difference?" "Exactly," replies the son. "I'll go with you tomorrow." The next day, the boy comes home and says, "Dad, did you go to the school?" "No, not yet," the father replies. "Well, when you do, stop by the gym teacher's office, too." "Why?" "Because in gym class, he asked me to raise my left arm, which I did. Then he told me to raise my right arm, and I did that too. Then he said, 'Lift your right leg,' so I did. Then he says, 'Now lift your left leg,' and I said, 'What? Am I supposed to stand on my penis?'" The father nods. Exactly, he says. I'll go. The next day, the boy asks, Dad, did you go to the school? No, not yet. Don't bother, the boy says. I got expelled. Expelled? Why? The father asks, shocked. Well, I got called to the principal's office and sitting there with the math teacher, the gym teacher, and the art teacher. The father raises an eyebrow. What was the art teacher doing there? That's what I bloody said. Mrs. Parks, the 16th grade science teacher, asked her class, which human body part increases to 10 times its size when stimulated? The class was silent until little Mary stood up looking shocked. You shouldn't be asking 6th graders a question like that. I'm going to tell my parents, and they'll go straight to the principal, and you'll get fired. Mrs. Parks ignored her and asked the question again. Which body part increases to 10 times its size when stimulated? Mary's jaw dropped, and she whispered to the kids around her. She's really going to get in trouble. Mrs. Parks continued, unfazed. Anybody? Finally, Billy stood up nervously, glanced around, and said, The pupil of the eye. Mrs. Parks smiled and said, Very good, Billy. Then she turned to Mary and added, Now, as for you, young lady, I have 3 things to say. 1, you have a dirty mind. 2, you didn't do your homework. And 3, one day you're going to be very, very disappointed. 4 sophomores at NC State University were doing so well in organic chemistry that they each had an A going into the final. The weekend before the exam, they decided to go to the University of Virginia to party. They had a great time, but after partying hard, they slept all day Sunday and didn't get back to Raleigh until early Monday morning. Instead of taking the final, they went to the professor to explain why they missed it. They told him they'd had a flat tire on the way back, no spare, and couldn't get help for a long time, so they missed the exam. The professor thought for a moment and agreed they could take the final the next day. They were thrilled and studied all night. The next day, they sat down to take the exam, each in a separate room. The first question was simple, worth 5 points, about free radical formation. They all thought, this is easy. After finishing that, they flipped the page to the second question, which read, for 95 points, which of your tires was flat? A beautiful woman is sitting next to a teenage boy on a plane. Suddenly, there's severe turbulence, and the plane begins a sharp nosedive. The captain's voice crackles over the intercom. I hate to say it, folks, but we may not walk away from this one. Panic spreads throughout the plane, except for the boy, who turns to the woman nervously and says, I hate to bother you, miss, but we might die, and I've never kissed anyone. The woman, a little shocked at first, thinks, why not? And leans in to give him a passionate kiss. The boy, grinning, says, Sorry to trouble you again, but we might die, and I've never felt a breast. The woman hesitates, but then decides, well, it's the end of the world, right? She lets him feel her up for a while. Afterward, the boy sheepishly adds, I'm really sorry, but we might die, and I've never made love to a woman. The woman, now fully committed to making the boy's last moments memorable, starts unbuttoning his pants. Just then the plane levels out, and the turbulence stops. Everyone exits the plane safely, and as they walk off, they all shake hands with the captain, thanking him for his skill in bringing them to safety. The woman, relieved, says to the boy, Thank you so much for saving us. The boy smiles and says, No problem, but next time, Dad, just a little longer. A bush pilot drops off Bob and Ted, 2 moose hunters, at a remote lake in northern Ontario. He warns them, I'll be back in a week, but I can't take off with more than 1 moose. A week later, the pilot returns to find the hunters have bagged 2 moose. He tells them, There's no way I can take off with both of those. Ted says, Last year, the pilot took off with 2 moose. Bob adds, Yeah, but maybe he wasn't a total coward. Determined not to be outdone, the pilot loads up and they begin to take off. The plane gathers speed, but the trees on the shore are coming up fast. Just before the plane lifts off, one wing clips a tree. The plane spins out of control, crashes, and breaks apart. Sometime later, Ted wakes up groggy and starts looking for Bob. He finds him, and when Bob comes to, he groans. Do you have any idea where we are? Ted shrugs and says, I think we're about 200 yards farther than last year. A jumbo jet is making its final approach into Toronto Airport. The pilot comes over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. We're on our final descent into Toronto. Thank you for flying with us today, and I hope you enjoy your stay in the city." Unfortunately, he forgets to turn off the intercom. The whole plane hears his conversation with the co-pilot. The co-pilot asks, "So, what are you going to do in Toronto, Skipper?" The captain replies, "First, I'll check into the hotel and take a big crap. Then I'm taking that new stewardess with the huge tits out for dinner. I'll wine and dine her, then take her back to my room and give it to her big time all night." Passengers start looking around the cabin, trying to figure out which stewardess the captain is talking about. Meanwhile, the new stewardess, who's at the back of the plane, overhears everything. Mortified, she tries to rush to the cockpit to turn off the intercom. Halfway down the aisle, she trips over an old lady's bag and falls. The old lady leans over, looks at her, and says, "No need to rush, dear. He's got to use the bathroom first." Seamus and Johnny were flying on Philippine Airlines when suddenly the engine failed. Sirens blared in the cockpit, and the pilot came over the intercom. "Dear passengers, this is your captain speaking. Unfortunately, we've lost one engine. But don't worry, I will ensure your safety. We will be landing on water." The plane makes a smooth water landing, and the captain calmly announces, "Hello, passengers. We've successfully landed on the water, and I hope everyone is okay. Now, all of the people who can swim, please move to the right side of the plane. Those who can't swim, please move to the left." Johnny turns to Seamus and says, "See, this is what I love about this airline. They always have a backup plan for everything." Seamus nods and replies, "Yeah, Pear. The crew's well trained for these kinds of situations." Once everyone is properly sorted according to their swimming abilities, the captain comes back on the intercom. "To those on the right side of the plane, please evacuate immediately and carefully, and to those on the left side, thank you for flying Philippine Airlines." Wife: "Honey, I need to get a bra." The husband sighed and said, "Leave it alone. The ones you have are so small to have a bra." The wife playfully replied, "Oh, really? Well, yesterday when you picked out new underwear for yourself, did I say anything to you?" A man boards an airplane, finds his seat, and settles in. As he looks up, he notices an incredibly beautiful woman walking toward him. To his surprise, she takes the seat right next to his. Eager to start a conversation, he blurts out, "Business trip or vacation?" She smiles and replies, "Business. I'm attending the annual Sexual Studies Convention in Chicago." The man, stunned by her beauty and the subject matter, struggles to keep his composure. "What's your role at the convention?" he asks. "I'm a lecturer," she says. "I use my personal experiences to share fascinating facts about sexuality." "Really?" he responds, his curiosity piqued. "Like what?" "Well," she says, "for example, Native American Indians are the most passionate lovers. Jewish men are the most likely to fully satisfy a woman, and, surprisingly, Southern rednecks last the longest." She suddenly blushes, realizing the nature of the conversation, and apologizes. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be discussing this with you. I don't even know your name." The man smiles, extends his hand, and says, "Tonto Goldstein, at your service, but my friends call me Bubba." An old man was walking through the desert with his donkey when he reached a village. The villagers welcomed him warmly, offering food, hospitality, and taking care of his donkey. As they sat down to dinner, the man was surprised to be served camel milk, which is known for its unpleasant taste. Curious, he asked why. The villagers explained that the village had been cursed with a never-ending drought, and they had to save every drop of water they could for crops. The old man smiled and said, "I am a wise man. I know how to bring rain, but first you must bring me a large bucket of water." The next morning, word of the old man's request spread throughout the village. The villagers gathered every last bit of water they had left, and after much effort, managed to fill a bucket. They handed it over to the old man, who then walked into his host's house. Inside, he took off his dirty clothes and began washing them. A curious child peered through the window and ran to tell the others. The villagers, angry and desperate, stormed over. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The old man had finished washing his clothes and was calmly hanging them out to dry. "Shame! How could you waste our precious water when our children have none to drink?" the chief scolded. Just as he spoke, the sky darkened, clouds gathered, and rain began to pour. The rain didn't stop for 5 straight days. The villagers' water reserves were replenished, and they celebrated the return of the life-giving rain. The old man was treated as a hero, and the chief, embarrassed, apologized profusely for doubting him. As the old man prepared to leave, the curious child finally gathered the courage to ask, "How did you do it?" The old man smiled and said, "It's simple. This always happens when I hang my clothes to dry." A guy walks into Home Depot and tells one of the employees, "I need an electric saw to cut down trees." The employee grins and says, "I've got just the thing. This beauty can cut down 100 trees a day." The guy buys it and goes home. A week later, he comes back looking angry. "This saw is terrible. I could only cut down 50 trees a day." The employee apologizes and says, "I'm sorry to hear that. We've got an even better option. This one cuts 200 trees a day." The guy's face lights up. He returns the old saw and buys the new one. A week later, he's back again, even angrier. "You promised me it would cut 200 trees, but I could only do 100. I want my money back." The employee, still apologetic, says, "I'm sorry to hear that, but we just got in a brand new, top-of-the-line saw. It cuts 400 trees a day." The guy returns the old saw and happily buys the new one. A week later, he storms into the store again. "I'm done, no matter what. I could only cut down 200 trees. The employee takes the saw, cranks it up, and the sound of the motor roars throughout the store. The guy looks at the employee in disbelief and asks, "What the hell is that sound?" A huge, muscular man with an unusually tiny head walks into a bar and orders a beer. The bartender hands him the drink and says, "You know, I'm not gay, but I have to compliment you on your physique. It's incredible. But I have to ask, why is your head so small?" The big guy nods, clearly used to this question. "Well, it's a long story," he begins. "One day, I was out hunting and got lost in the woods. Suddenly, I heard someone crying for help and realized it was coming from a frog sitting by the stream. I picked it up, and the frog said, 'Kiss me, and I'll turn into a genie. I'll grant you 3 wishes.' So I kissed the frog, and poof, she turned into a beautiful, voluptuous, naked woman." The bartender's eyes widen as the man continues. "She told me, 'You have 3 wishes. What's your first?' I looked down at my scrawny 60 kilograms body and said, 'I want a body like Arnold Schwarzenegger.' She nodded, whispered a spell, and poof, I was so huge I ripped out of my clothes and was standing there naked. She asked, 'What will your second wish be?' I looked at her body and said, 'I want to make passionate love to you right here by the stream.' She smiled, lay down, and we spent hours making love. Later, as we lay together, sweat dripping from our glorious love-making, she whispered, 'You know, you still have one more wish. What will it be?' I looked at her and said, 'How about a little head?'"